congressional hearing room fell silent as Congressman Clay Higgins rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Pointing directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he shouted, "You will not interrupt me again." His voice echoed through the chamber. "Where I come from, we have ways of handling people like you." The entire room gasped as Crockett's eyes widened, taken aback by the threatening tone of her colleague. What began as a routine oversight committee hearing had suddenly turned into one of the most shocking confrontations in recent congressional history. Within moments, lawmakers from both parties were on their feet, demanding immediate disciplinary action against Higgins. The committee chair struck the gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but the damage had already been done. The exchange had been caught on camera and was spreading rapidly across social media. Few realized it then, but this moment would set off the fastest congressional censure in modern history. Before diving deeper into this unbelievable story, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more political updates. You won't want to miss what happens next in this unprecedented congressional standoff. Congressman Clay Higgins wasn't just another member of Congress. The former Louisiana law enforcement officer had earned a reputation as a tough-talking, no-nonsense figure, often compared to a modern-day John Wayne. His campaign videos, featuring him in SWAT gear, had gone viral years earlier, and his supporters admired his blunt, confrontational style. Standing at 6'2" with a commanding presence, Higgins prided himself on speaking his mind, often saying he didn't come to Washington to make friends. For years, his aggressive attitude had been largely tolerated on both sides of the aisle. Supporters viewed him as authentic, an American truth-teller cutting through political spin. Conservative outlets often showcased his fiery speeches targeting Democrats with biting remarks that stretched the limits of congressional decorum. However, in recent months, Higgins' behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. Just 3 weeks earlier, he stormed out of a hearing after being asked to yield his time. A week later, he called a witness a puppet before the chair could step in. Quietly, some Republicans began to worry that his conduct was becoming a political risk, though few said so publicly. Across the table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure in the Democratic Party. A former civil rights attorney from Texas, Crockett had built a strong reputation since joining Congress. With degrees from Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, she brought both academic depth and real-world legal experience to her role. Her questioning style was sharp and precise, resembling courtroom cross-examination more than political. Grandstanding Crockett had also faced significant challenges as a Black woman in Congress. After her passionate speech defending voting rights went viral the previous year, she received multiple threats, but she refused to be intimidated. "I didn't survive Texas politics to be silenced in Washington," she often said. Her colleagues admired her intellect and composure under pressure. That day's Oversight Committee hearing was expected to be routine, focused on federal spending priorities with testimony from the Treasury Secretary, yet tensions were already high. Earlier that week, Higgins had appeared on a conservative podcast, accusing Democratic members of being unpatriotic and questioning their loyalty to America. Committee Chairman James Reynolds had privately urged both sides to remain civil. "This is about fiscal policy, not personal attacks," he reminded them before the hearing began. The nation was watching closely. With funding deadlines approaching, any sign of dysfunction could rattle already uneasy financial markets. Unbeknownst to most, Higgins entered the hearing already on edge. His staff had shown him a tweet from the previous night in which Crockett called his budget proposals mathematically impossible and morally bankrupt. To him, this wasn't just political criticism, it was personal. As the session began, colleagues noticed his tense posture and clenched jaw as the Treasury Secretary delivered his opening remarks. The stakes were high. Every member knew that any outburst could further erode public trust in Congress, which was already near historic lows. As questioning began, the atmosphere in the room felt combustible, like a powder keg ready to ignite. No one could have anticipated just how quickly it would happen, or how serious the fallout would be. 30 minutes into the hearing, Chairman Reynolds finally recognized Congressman Higgins for his 5 minutes of questioning. Higgins wasted no time going on the attack, barely acknowledging the Treasury Secretary seated before him. "The American people are being deceived," Higgins declared, his voice already rising. While my Democratic colleagues claim to care about fiscal responsibility, they continue to push spending plans that would bankrupt this country. The Treasury Secretary attempted to respond, but Higgins cut him off sharply. I haven't asked my question yet, sir. From 3 seats away, Congresswoman Crockett tensed. She had seen this pattern before. Higgins using his time not to question witnesses, but to deliver campaign-style speeches. The chairman shifted in his seat, uneasy, yet allowed Higgins to proceed. The people in my district work hard for their money, Higgins continued, his tone growing more forceful. They don't want it wasted on far-left projects dreamed up by lawmakers who've never held a real job. Several Democrats voiced objections, but Higgins spoke over them. The Treasury Secretary tried again. Congressman, I'd be happy to address specific budget questions. I'm not finished, Higgins snapped. The American people deserve honesty about where their tax dollars go. Unlike some here, I actually care about this nation's working men and women. Crockett raised her hand, requesting that the chairman enforce committee rules about directing remarks to witnesses, not colleagues. Chairman Reynolds nodded firmly. The gentleman is reminded to direct his questions to the witness. Higgins scowled but shifted course. Mr. Secretary, do you think the spending proposals from across the aisle are fiscally responsible? Before the secretary could respond, Higgins pressed on. Of course they're not. They're absurd. Just like the so-called experts who claim to understand economics but can't even balance their own checkbooks. That was enough for Crockett. Point of order, Mr. Chairman, she interjected. The gentleman is clearly violating committee rules with personal attacks. Higgins turned toward her, his face darkening. I don't need a lecture from you about rules. The gentlewoman is correct, Chairman Reynolds intervened. Congressman Higgins, please direct your remarks to the chair and your questions to the witness. This is my time, Higgins shot back. I won't be silenced by procedural tricks. The tension in the room thickened. Members shifted uneasily. Staffers exchanged worried looks, and journalists in the press gallery took furious notes. The hearing was no longer about the budget. It had become the story itself. Higgins resumed questioning but kept his confrontational tone. When the Treasury Secretary gave an answer he disliked, Higgins interrupted again. That's Washington double talk. Give me a straight answer. Congressman, if you'd allow me to finish, the Secretary began. I've heard enough, Higgins interrupted. Same old story. You come here, read from prepared notes, and avoid real questions. Following protocol, Crockett addressed the chair. Mr. Chairman, the witness should be allowed to answer without interruption. That's when Higgins lost his composure entirely. He slammed his hand on the table, rose to his feet, and pointed directly at Crockett. You will not interrupt me again, he shouted. Where I come from, we have ways of dealing with people like you. A collective gasp swept through the room. Even Higgins's Republican colleagues appeared stunned. The implied threat, especially from a white male member toward a black female colleague, was unmistakable. Chairman Reynolds immediately struck the gavel. The gentleman will suspend. That comment is completely out of order. But the damage was done. Crockett sat motionless, her expression calm but visibly shaken. Democratic members rose to object, while Republicans urged Higgins to sit down. I won't be interrupted by her, Higgins continued, still standing, still pointing. She needs to learn some respect. Congressman Marcus Johnson, seated beside Crockett, stood. Mr. Chairman, I move that the gentleman's words be taken down. This rare procedural move required the clerk to record Higgins's exact words for possible disciplinary action. Chairman Reynolds nodded gravely. The gentleman from Louisiana will take his seat. The clerk will record the words. Chaos filled the room. Staffers whispered urgently. Reporters rushed out with breaking updates. And the Treasury Secretary sat forgotten, stunned by the sudden breakdown of decorum. Chairman Reynolds called a 15-minute recess to restore order. As members exited, party lines were clear. Democrats gathered protectively around Crockett, while most Republicans avoided looking at Higgins, who stood alone, still angry but beginning to sense the seriousness of his actions. Outside in the hallway, Reporters surrounded Crockett with questions. She raised a hand for quiet. "I serve to uphold the law and the Constitution," she said firmly. "No American should face threats for doing their job, least of all in the United States Congress. What we witnessed today was not just an attack on me, but on the dignity this institution demands." As cameras flashed, she remained composed. "I will not be intimidated into silence. Not today, not ever." Meanwhile, a few doors away, Higgins faced his own swarm of reporters. "My comments are being misinterpreted," he claimed, though his tone lacked conviction. "Where I'm from, we handle interruptions through procedure." Few believed him. Even friendly media outlets pressed him about the threatening nature of his words. By the time the recess neared its end, congressional leaders from both parties were being briefed. The confrontation was quickly escalating into a serious matter of conduct. Inside, Chairman Reynolds consulted with the parliamentarian about next steps. This was no longer ordinary partisan conflict. A clear line had been crossed. The only question was how Congress would respond. When Reynolds reconvened the hearing, the atmosphere was tense and subdued. The Treasury Secretary had been quietly escorted out. "This hearing will not continue as planned," Reynolds began gravely. "What transpired here today is not only a violation of committee rules, but an affront to the standards of conduct every member pledges to uphold. The clerk has recorded Congressman Higgins's words, which will be referred to the House Ethics Committee immediately." But several members felt that wasn't sufficient. Congresswoman Eleanor Martinez stood. "Mr. Chairman, while I respect the ethics process, the seriousness of today's events demands immediate action. I move that we recess this committee and bring the matter before the full House under a privileged resolution. A privileged resolution would compel the entire House to address the issue immediately, a rare and serious step." What happened next surprised everyone. Congressman Richard Blackburn, a Republican and close Higgins ally, rose. "Mr. Chairman, I second the motion," he said firmly. "Some issues go beyond politics. Protecting the integrity of this institution is one of them." Higgins looked stunned as his own colleagues distanced themselves. He tried to speak, but Reynolds recognized another member instead. Within 30 minutes, the committee voted overwhelmingly to recess and refer the issue to the full House. Only 3 members, Higgins's closest allies, opposed the motion. As news spread through the Capitol, the situation escalated rapidly. The Speaker of the House returned urgently from another meeting, and party leaders convened emergency sessions. Security was increased around both Crockett's and Higgins's offices as social media erupted over the confrontation. By 2:00 p.m., barely 3 hours after the exchange, the full House was called into session. Members rushed back from meetings, aware they were witnessing a historic moment. The Speaker called the House to order, recognizing the majority leader, who introduced a resolution to censure Congressman Higgins. One of the most severe penalties short of expulsion, censure, would require Higgins to stand before the chamber, as the formal rebuke was read aloud. "Madam Speaker," the majority leader began, "what occurred today cannot be dismissed as a moment of anger or routine partisanship. When a member threatens another, particularly when that threat echoes a painful history of intimidation, this body must respond with absolute clarity." ChatGPT said. The minority leader then rose to speak, a moment everyone had been waiting for. Would Republicans rally behind Higgins despite his actions? "The people sent us here to debate passionately," he began, choosing his words with care. "Strong disagreement is part of our democracy, but threats or acts of intimidation cross a line this institution must never accept, no matter which side they come from." For the next hour, lawmakers from both parties took the floor. Several Democrats shared personal experiences with intimidation and threats. A number of female representatives described the additional challenges women in politics face when confronted with hostility from male colleagues. Most notably, a senior Republican Congresswoman from Georgia addressed Higgins directly. "I've served with you for years," she said. "We've stood together on many issues, but today, you did not uphold the principles of our party or the trust of those who elected you. We cannot defend what cannot be justified." Throughout these remarks, Higgins sat alone, an increasingly isolated figure. Even his usual allies kept their distance. His expression shifted from anger to the heavy awareness of his situation. When it was Crockett's turn to speak, the chamber fell silent. She approached the podium with calm composure, her back straight, her tone firm. "I stand before you not only as the target of today's threats," she began, "but as someone who has devoted her life to upholding the rule of law. Before Congress, I represented clients who faced intimidation for simply exercising their constitutional rights. I never expected to experience the same within these walls." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "This is not about me or even about Congressman Higgins. It's about whether we honor the oath we take, whether this chamber is governed by rules and respect, or by fear and intimidation." As Crockett spoke, cameras captured the reactions around the room. Members of both parties nodded in agreement. Even those who often opposed her politically acknowledged the strength of her message and the fairness of her stance. "I did not come to Washington to be threatened," she concluded. "I came to represent my constituents and defend the Constitution. I ask my colleagues to reaffirm that in this chamber, no one stands above the rules. No one has the right to threaten another member, and every one of us, regardless of party, race, or gender, deserves to serve without fear." The applause that followed was swift and bipartisan. Lawmakers rose to their feet, recognizing not only her words, but the dignity with which she faced the entire ordeal. When the debate ended, the Speaker called for a vote on the censure resolution. The electronic board on the chamber wall lit up as members cast their votes. Though the result was expected, everyone watched closely for the final margin. When the tally appeared, it read, 422 in favor, 8 opposed, and 5 present. It was one of the most decisive censure votes in modern congressional history. The Speaker then asked Congressman Higgins to step into the well of the House, the area directly before the Speaker's rostrum. This part of the process, where a member must stand alone as their censure is read aloud, is meant to be uncomfortable. Congress's version of public shaming. Higgins walked slowly to the designated spot. The confidence and defiance he'd shown earlier in the day were gone. Standing with his hands clasped, he listened as the Speaker read the resolution. Representative Clay Higgins of Louisiana is hereby censured for his threatening remarks toward a fellow member, behavior unbecoming of the House of Representatives and conduct that brings discredit upon this institution. The chamber was silent as the words echoed. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment for history. Less than 6 hours had passed between Higgins's threatening comments and his formal censure, possibly the fastest disciplinary action in congressional memory. As Higgins returned to his seat, the triumph of institutional norms over intimidation was clear. In an era defined by political division, this moment of near-unanimous condemnation marked something rare, a line that nearly everyone agreed should never be crossed. The fallout from the Higgins-Crockett confrontation spread far beyond Capitol Hill. By evening, every major news outlet led with the story. Split-screen footage showed Higgins's threatening gesture beside Crockett's composed response. Political analysts across the spectrum agreed. This was a defining moment in congressional conduct. Social media erupted. Hashtags like Dr. Crockett Strong and the Higgins Gone Wild trended nationwide. Within hours, videos of the incident had been viewed more than 20 million times. Commentators observed that while Congress had grown more polarized, this episode managed to unite lawmakers in defense of basic respect and decorum. When Crockett left the Capitol that evening, she was met by a crowd of supporters who had gathered after watching the events unfold. They cheered as she appeared, many holding hastily made signs of encouragement. She didn't make a speech. She simply thanked them and said, "Today, our institutions worked as they should. That's worth celebrating." Back in her office, Crockett's phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Colleagues she barely knew reached out in solidarity. 3 former presidents sent personal notes of support. Her campaign reported a massive surge in small-dollar donations, over $1.2 million raised within hours, an extraordinary figure for a non-election period. For Higgins, the aftermath was starkly different. He exited the Capitol through a back door, avoiding reporters. His staff released a short statement. Congressman Higgins acknowledges his comments were inappropriate and accepts the disciplinary action of the House. Notably, It contained no direct apology to Crockett. But his troubles were far from over. By the next morning, several major donors suspended their contributions. His Louisiana district office reported thousands of calls, nearly 10-to-1 condemning his behavior. Local newspapers, usually supportive, published harsh editorials criticizing his conduct. Even Republican leaders in his state stayed silent, a sign political observers said spoke volumes. They were clearly weighing whether Higgins had become a liability. Within days, the story shifted from a personal confrontation to a broader conversation about the tone of political discourse in America. Morning news shows hosted discussions on the rise of threatening language in politics. Prominent historians noted that while Congress had once seen physical altercations in the 19th century, such open hostility had largely vanished in modern times. When asked about the incident, the White House press secretary said the president believes political disagreement should never include intimidation or threats. Pressed on whether the president supported the censure, she simply replied, "The vote speaks for itself." 3 days later, the longer-term effects began to unfold. The House Ethics Committee launched a formal investigation into Higgins's broader pattern of behavior, not just this single episode. Former staff members came forward, describing similar outbursts behind closed doors, suggesting a troubling history that was only now coming to light. Meanwhile, Crockett received invitations to appear on several national television programs, but declined most of them, choosing instead to return to her district for her already scheduled town halls. When she finally gave an interview a week later, she shifted the focus away from the confrontation and toward the legislative work that had been disrupted by the incident. "The American people didn't elect us to fight each other," she said. "They sent us to fight for them, for better health care, better jobs, and greater opportunities. That's where my attention remains." Political analysts observed that Crockett's calm and deliberate response not only elevated her national standing but also reinforced her image as a serious lawmaker rather than someone chasing publicity. Following the incident, her approval ratings in her district rose by 12 points in post-event polling. In Congress, the episode prompted leadership to review decorum standards more broadly. The Speaker announced the formation of a bipartisan task force to examine and possibly strengthen the rules governing member behavior. "What happened was addressed quickly and decisively," she stated. "But we should also take this opportunity to ensure that our rules are clear and that our enforcement mechanisms are effective." Perhaps the most unexpected development came 2 weeks later, when a group of high school civics teachers created a classroom curriculum based on the event. The program was designed to teach students about congressional processes, ethical standards for public officials, and the importance of civil dialogue in a democracy. Within the first week, the materials were downloaded by more than 5,000 teachers. The confrontation also led to self-reflection among media commentators who had once praised aggressive political rhetoric. Several pundits who had previously applauded Higgins's tell-it-like-it-is approach began to question whether such praise had helped foster an environment where threats or intimidation seemed acceptable. "There's a difference between being genuine and being hostile," admitted one conservative commentator who had frequently featured Higgins in the past. For party strategists preparing for the upcoming election, the Higgins-Crockett incident became a cautionary example of how quickly political fortunes can shift. Once considered secure in his solidly Republican district, Higgins now faced the real possibility of a primary challenger. Party officials privately worried that the incident had created unexpected vulnerability in a district they had long viewed as safe. Meanwhile, Crockett's national visibility grew substantially. Party leaders began including her in key strategy discussions, and several presidential hopefuls reached out to explore potential campaign collaborations. Political observers even began speculating about her as a future Senate candidate, or perhaps for an even higher office. 6 months later, the impact was still evident. Higgins announced that he would not seek re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with family, a common Washington expression for stepping down under pressure. Although he never issued a public apology to Crockett, sources reported that he had sent her a private letter expressing regret for his actions. Crockett, in turn, transformed her increased recognition into tangible legislative progress. 2 of the major bills she introduced gained bipartisan backing and were signed into law, an uncommon achievement for a relatively new member of Congress. When asked about the Higgins incident in later interviews, she consistently redirected the conversation to policy, refusing to let a single confrontation define her career. The most notable outcome, however, was what followed, a brief but visible improvement in congressional decorum. Lawmakers from both parties appeared more cautious with their language and behavior, aware of the rapid consequences Higgins had faced. The boundary had been drawn clearly, and for a while, few seemed willing to test it. As political scholars later noted, in an era where norms are often challenged and limits pushed, the Higgins censure served as a reminder that some lines cannot be crossed without repercussions. Whether this marks a lasting shift toward civility or just a temporary pause remains uncertain. If this dramatic exchange between Clay Higgins and Jasmine Crockett revealed anything, it's that standards of conduct in our political institutions still matter. While passionate debate is vital to democracy, threats and intimidation have no place in the halls of Congress. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth political coverage and analysis from Washington. Share your views in the comments. Was congressional censure the right response, or should tougher action have been taken?